What is affirmative action?
I will get back to you on that.
Affirmative action? I don't know.
I don't know. Affirmative action has something to do with minorities.
Affirmative action is a complicated policy, which is why it is especially controversial in today's society.
It's mainly concerned with the educational opportunities of minorities and affects our generation's future.
Affirmative action is often a sensitive subject, and that's why it's important to our presidential race.
We need the new president to correctly address affirmative action and deal with it in a constitutional and fair manner.
Affirmative action is a government or private program designed to redress historic injustices against specific groups by making special efforts to provide members of these groups with access to educational and employment opportunities.
Affirmative action involves efforts by employers, government institutions, educational institutions to reach out to groups, and usually racial minorities, who have generally been the subject of discriminatory treatment by those same agencies in order to give them a fair and equal opportunity.
Affirmative action began in 1941 when Franklin D. Roosevelt forbade discriminatory hiring practices for federal jobs. It continued into the 1960s in the heat of the Civil Rights Movement. President John F. Kennedy first used the term affirmative action in an executive order instructing government contractors to encourage affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that employees are treated equally during employment, without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin.
To further increase numbers of minority employees, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed an executive order in 1965 that required government contractors to use affirmative action policies in their hiring. Colleges also began to implement systems of affirmative action after this executive order. Prior to this policy, only 5% of undergraduate students were African American. The intent of affirmative action was to provide equal opportunities for minorities who had previously been discriminated against. However, some feel that affirmative action no longer lives up to that intention.
Why is affirmative action so controversial?
Affirmative action, however, was quickly transformed into a program of racial preferences and racial double standards. I believe those racial preferences and racial double standards harm not only whites, but also Asians, many of whom were in fact disadvantaged by discrimination. And I believe those racial preferences and double standards ultimately hurt the very people they are intended to help.
Because they make people uncomfortable. Always engenders a discussion. Very fine line between promoting divisiveness and promoting an awareness.
We have such a frazzled race relation history in this country, and people have a difficult time talking about race. That's part of what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about. It makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable, and I think a lot of us don't want to acknowledge this very disturbing history of discrimination that permeates our country's history. So when you start raising issues like this, it creates a level of discomfort and leads to these disputes.
While the Black Lives Matter movement and affirmative action don't seem to be closely linked, they fight for the same thing. Affirmative action was created to redress former injustices and discrimination suffered by racial minorities. Black Lives Matter also focuses on these injustices that minorities suffer, but they feel that discrimination is still present today. Therefore, affirmative action must continue. If affirmative action was eliminated, there would be a detrimental effect.
Over the years, affirmative action has not been overly disputed in Rhode Island, but in other states the elimination of this policy has been largely discussed in the courts.
In University of California v. Bakke, the Supreme Court ruled against the university's attempt at affirmative action. In 1978, when applicant Alan Bakke was not accepted into the school, even though his test scores were higher than some of the minority test scores, he sued the California Davis Medical School for violating his civil rights. In the California Davis Medical School admissions plan, they had set aside 16 places for minority applicants. This was seen as unconstitutional because the medical school had set aside a quota of acceptance for special minorities. Because of this court case, affirmative action policies cannot include racial quotas.
Fisher v. University of Texas.
In 2008, Abigail Fisher, a Caucasian female, applied to the University of Texas. She was then denied admission, which led her to file a lawsuit against the school. Fisher claimed that the school's use of race and its admission process was the reason she was denied entry into the school. The district court originally ruled in favor of the University of Texas, and so did the United States Court of Appeals. But since then, Fisher has appealed to the two courts' decisions.
No, I certainly don't think there are any negative effects whatsoever. I think it can only help to be inclusive, to promote diversity. I mean, these are key elements of a society that I think thrives better. And again, the only argument, I think the argument on the other side.
Affirmative action really means an opportunity for all of our students to go to institutions of higher learning with a diverse student body that embodies and reflects America.
Overall, the 2016 presidential candidates need to focus on affirmative action because so many people are uninformed about this policy and there are so many views regarding it.
In order to correct racial injustices, we need to accept that such issues exist.
Our generation should talk about these issues no matter how uncomfortable they may seem.
Our next president must promote equality and take a stand against racial injustice that still exists in our world today.